Right, hi, and welcome everybody. My name is Rihanna Putnam. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for the Citizen Science Association. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Leah Shanley, who's a Senior Fellow at the Nelson Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also an advisor to SciStarter, and she's a member of the steering committee for the CSA's Law and Policy Working Group, who's been coordinating this webinar series. I have a few brief slides to share about CSA, and then I'll turn it over to Leah to introduce our panelists in just a few minutes. There we go. The CSA, for those of you who are new to us, is a member-driven organization that connects people from a wide range of experiences around a shared purpose of advancing knowledge through research and monitoring done by, for, and with the public. This work takes place in almost every discipline and requires a wide range of skills. Our efforts are concentrated into a biennial conference. Our next one is going to be in May of 2021 in Phoenix, Arizona, and we're excited to be starting to plan that already. We also have a peer-reviewed journal called Citizen Science Theory and Practice that you can access online. There's lots of great resources there. We also have a growing number of member services, such as our working groups, online networking, and webinars like these. Our membership represents the multidisciplinary and multidimensional nature of the field. We have a wide representation of project leaders, researchers, evaluators, and a growing number of students and community science professionals and folks leading efforts in their own communities. Our membership benefits include things like conference discounts, a monthly newsletter, the ability to vote in board elections, and there's a growing number of online networking opportunities. Our membership aligns and supports the association's mission, and we encourage you to go to our website and find out more about how to join or renew there. The link's on the screen. There's lots of ways to get involved with the CSA. It's a great way to make connections, to grow as a leader in the field, and also to help support the association. Our working groups are one of the key ways that we work to advance the goals of the CSA through the sharing of resources, best practices, and relevant information, both among group members, but also with members of the community through webinars like these, and also through resource guides and things on our website. We also have a new set of association teams that are working on discrete tasks to help build the association. You can find out more about how to get involved with those on our website. Folks meet pretty regularly, and there's lots of different ways to do that. Sorry, this webinar will be recorded and uploaded to a playlist on our YouTube channel. You can find out information about upcoming webinars and past webinars and view all of the webinars that we've done. Both our Law and Policy Working Group and Ethics Working Group, who are coordinating this webinar, have done some really great webinars over the past year or so, and you can find those on the YouTube channel, and we encourage you to check those out. Lastly, we do have everybody on the call today in listen-only mode, and so we encourage you to use the chat to engage. You'll find the chat in the menu bar at the bottom. There'll either be a little speech bubble, or if you're not seeing that, you can click the 3 dots, and if you click there, you'll see the chat box. You'll want to make sure that the 2 box says to all panelists and attendees, so that way everybody can see your question. Feel free throughout the presentations to pose any questions, and our moderator will feed those back to panelists at the end. We'll have some time for Q&A then. And yeah, I think that's all I have for there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah to introduce our panelists. And again, thanks everyone for being here.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't see myself on the screen. So welcome, everyone. I'm Leah Shanley. I'm, as Rihanna mentioned, a fellow at the Nelson Institute and an advisor to SciStarter. I'm also on the steering committee of the Citizen Science Association's new Law and Policy Working Group, and have been organizing a series of webinars focused on the legal and policy issues for citizen science. I encourage all of you to reach out and hopefully join our working group. Today's webinar we're doing collaboratively with the Citizen Science Association's Ethics Working Group through Lisa Rasmussen. So we're very excited to have this joint webinar today. Today's subject is approaching informed consent to citizen science for the legal and ethical issues. How do we know when citizen science contributors consent to participation in a research project? What are the risks to citizen science contributors? What are the risks to citizen science project owners? Sometimes citizen science research is subject to federal regulations, sometimes it's not. How do we know? So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa Rasmussen to set the frame.
Hey everyone, I'm Lisa Rasmussen. I'm one of two co-chairs for the Ethics Working Group, and Stacy Lynn is the other. We welcome anyone who is on this webinar to join us in the Ethics Working Group if you're interested. And Leah and I started talking about doing informed consent as a joint project because obviously there's a lot of overlap. We're going to focus on both legal questions and ethical questions and then talk through a couple of examples. And I think at this point I will turn it over to Christy Guarini to guide us through some of the legal issues. Christy?
Great, thanks Lisa. Okay, so I'd like to begin just by laying a conceptual foundation for the discussion. So let's start at the broadest level. What is consent? Well, according to general dictionaries, consent simply is agreement. It means I agree. In the legal realm, though, consent has an added element of accountability in the sense that when you consent, you're accepting the general consequences of doing so. This means that your consent can be a defense to allegations that someone else has harmed you. So the defense says, well, you consented to the risks of those harms. Now, all day, every day, we know this, we're providing consent. When we buy gas with our credit cards, we agree to pay back the credit card company. And when we visit the doctor, we consent to be treated. Now, the kind of consent that's provided in each of these circumstances is heavily influenced by background legal rules. In some cases, those rules imply our consent and they don't require robust disclosure of risks. So for example, when your doctor draws your blood to run routine tests, you usually don't have to sign a specific consent form for this. That's because your consent can be implied from the fact that you made an appointment with the doctor, you showed up to the appointment, and you stuck out your arm and allowed a needle to poke it. But in other cases, written consent might be specifically required by federal or state law. So here I'll pause to say that I am focusing on US laws, but of course all jurisdictions have laws of consent. And I want to acknowledge that in some cases, perhaps many, they might diverge from US laws. Now, the laws may require consent in a specific form, or the laws can be ambiguous, which might cause some to err on the side of obtaining written consent. And sometimes we just ask others to sign consent forms to limit our own liability. Citizen science also, of course, operates against background legal rules of consent. And arguably the most relevant of these require a heightened form of consent we call informed consent. And that is informed consent to participate in research. So here I'd like to use just a really simple, oversimplified conceptual model to think through how those laws apply to citizen science. So according to the model, the kind of consent that's required in a particular citizen science project will depend on the role of the citizen scientist in that research. So they are either allowing others to act on their person or their data, that's encompassed by the idea of their person, or they themselves are undertaking the action. So the first role is, of course, passive. The citizen scientist or her data is what's being studied, so we call her a research subject. That's because she's being subjected to an intervention. Fortunately, as a side note, I'll say we are moving away from that terminology and referring to research subjects as research participants. But because of the power and the presumed knowledge differential between that person and the person acting on her, she's considered vulnerable in the eyes of the law and in need of protection. And that is, in fact, the impulse behind what's called the Common Rule. So the Common Rule refers to U.S. regulations that were first adopted in the 1980s in response to decades of known research abuses. These include the Nazi experiments on prisoners in World War II, the Tuskegee syphilis study that was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service for 40 years, and various other studies that subjected vulnerable populations to really egregious harms that were famously exposed in this 1966 article by Henry Beecher. A centerpiece of the Common Rule is the requirement that research participants provide their informed consent to participate. And the Common Rule articulates what information must be disclosed to these participants and how it must be disclosed to ensure that their consent is truly informed. So the Common Rule lays out 9 what are called basic elements that must be disclosed to all participants, and these include a description of reasonably foreseeable risks and benefits to them, as well as provisions for keeping confidential any data that's collected, and a statement that participation is voluntary and can end at any time. And there are another 9 what are called additional elements that have to be disclosed, quote unquote, when appropriate. And these include, for example, a statement that participants will be provided findings that are developed during the research that might impact their willingness to continue participating. The Common Rule also specifies how researchers are required to go about obtaining consent. So the information I just mentioned, it has to be provided in a language that's understandable to the participants. It must be presented in a manner intended to maximize their understanding. So bullet point lists of facts are specifically discouraged. And in addition, this information has to be provided in a setting that allows potential participants to ask questions and otherwise minimizes the possibility of their coercion. In general, the last thing I'll mention is that informed consent to participate in research does have to be obtained in writing. Now, importantly, the Common Rule doesn't apply to all research. So for one, it applies only to federally funded research, US federally funded research. So citizen science projects that aren't federally funded aren't required to comply with the Common Rule. But as a parenthetical, I'll just say that a few states have adopted their own research subject protections. There are also FDA research subject protections, and those possibly might apply. But second, the Common Rule generally applies to research that we call human subjects research. And the definition is actually a little more complex than may be apparent from that term. But in general, it encompasses, according to the new Common Rule, the revisions that were adopted at the beginning of the year, it encompasses activities where data or biospecimens are taken from a person through some sort of intervention or interaction, and then those data or specimens are later studied. So citizen science projects that study marine life or weather, for example, aren't required to comply with the Common Rule, so long as, and this is an important point that I'll return to in just a minute, citizen scientists aren't also being studied. And that brings me back to the conceptual model. So an individual's role in research it potentially can be active and not passive. And so in that role, the citizen scientist isn't being acted upon, but instead is the one doing the acting. And as an actor in research, she's not considered to be vulnerable from a legal perspective, and for this reason isn't protected by the Common Rule. However, there may be other laws that require that she be informed of and consent to the risks of her activities, depending on the nature of those activities. And even if no laws require it, it might be smart for the project to obtain her consent, maybe, for example, in a volunteer agreement, to limit liability. Or, as Lisa will discuss in a few minutes, a project might choose to do so to obtain consent for reasons unrelated to the law, so simply because it's the right thing to do. Before I do turn it over to Lisa, I have time to touch on just 2 complications. Excuse me. And the first concerns what happens when a citizen science project involves citizen scientists in both roles. This happens in some biomedical projects. So for example, when a person is executing a study and including herself in the study population. But it also occurs when a project that involves citizen scientists, let's say only as data collectors, decides to start studying its citizen scientists. So for example, maybe to understand their motivations for participating or to determine whether there are any health benefits from participating. If citizen scientists become the subject of investigation, the study might come within the scope of the common rule. However, I'll note that it might fall within a regulatory exception, which I don't have time to cover. But the takeaway here is that projects should be aware that positioning their citizen scientists in dual roles does have legal repercussions. And the second complication concerns the fact that the common rule is narrowly focused on consequences to individual research participants. It wasn't designed to take into account harms to communities. And this suggests, to the extent we want to look to the common rule as a model of informed consent in community-based citizen science projects, some adjustments might be needed to account for those community-level concerns. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
So thank you, Christy. We really appreciate your presentation. If folks have a clarifying question, if they would please enter it in the Q&A box while we're transitioning to Lisa's presentation. You can see the Q&A icon at the bottom, but if you have trouble finding it, you also can add your question to the chat box.
Hey everyone.
Are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
Okay. Again, as the panelists are talking, please enter your information in the Q&A box if you have a question for any of the panelists, and we will get to it during the group discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce Lisa Rasmussen. She's Dr. Lisa Rasmussen. She's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and a faculty fellow in the Graduate School at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. One of Lisa's main research areas is in research ethics. She's currently working on a book manuscript on unregulated research, so we look forward to that. Lisa, take it away.
Thanks. So, whoops. All right. Sorry, have to use a different button to control this. So what I have to say is largely compatible with what Christy was just going over. And I think it probably doesn't need to be noted, but I will anyway, that there's a difference between law and ethics. So while we try and capture ethical principles we are committed to in our law, sometimes we don't capture what everybody is committed to. So I wanted to think about the ethical aspect, particularly because a significant number of citizen science projects may not be covered by the laws and thus need to think about what the ethical obligations are independent of the laws. So I thought I'd start with thinking generally about why we might have an ethical obligation to ask for informed consent in the first place. And I think it's for two reasons. One is to acknowledge inequalities in understanding, education, social capital and power, or material resources between someone asking for consent and someone giving consent. We also want to respect individuals' right to self-determination. And so when you put those two things together, informed consent attempts to do that by moving towards greater equality of information and power. So generally, the ethical principles of informed consent, which are also cashed out legally, are one is what exactly we mean by informed, and that has generally understood three separate pieces. One is the adequate provision of information, which I'll talk about in a minute. The next is the capacity to understand information, and the appreciation that information in fact applies to oneself and not to some abstract. And finally, you need to be voluntarily and uncoercedly consenting to something. So informed consent issues in citizen science look a little bit different potentially. So one question is who should be giving consent and who should be asking it. Another is what standards of information should be used. And third is consent, the right interpretation of the ways in which we ought to be transparent when we're doing citizen science research. So who should give consent? Well, the usual understanding of informed consent assumes a clear hierarchy of knowledge or power. So we're thinking about the typical researcher and subject, and the researcher knows more about what's going on, may know more about the science behind whatever they're doing the research on, and the subject is typically uninformed or less informed. So there's an asymmetry. But in citizen science, the asymmetries might look really different, if indeed there even are asymmetries. And so one of the things we have to think about is how to acknowledge and remedy those asymmetries. So that might cash out as who should obtain whose consent. The other aspect, which Christy already mentioned, is what about community consent? So our typical understanding of consent is individualistic. We ask a person to give consent. But citizen science projects might be community-led or have community-level impacts, or both, rather than or in addition to individual impacts. And so what are the ethical obligations to the communities to ask for endorsement by the community? So in terms of the standards of informing, there are conventional understandings of this. One is the professional or local standards. So in other words, ethically, you should disclose to the person who's consenting whatever is normal in your profession or your locale, whatever it happens to be. And there are problems with each of these. The second one is the actual individual preferences standard. So you should tell a person what that person actually would want to know in order to consent voluntarily to this project. And then finally, the standard that's usually adopted is the reasonable person standard. So recognizing the limitations in a professional or local standard and how idiosyncratic that might be, how embedded in problematic assumptions those might be, and also acknowledging the difficulties in finding out what an actual person actually wants to know. We've adopted a reasonable person standard. So we should disclose to people the information that most people would want to know. But there are additional issues in citizen science, such as what information about benefits and risks to communities should be shared when we're giving information. Which party has information that other people might want to know, right? So if you're doing informed consent in citizen science, it's not clear always who has the consenting power and who should consent to what's the research being proposed. So informed consent in citizen science might be much more mutual and result from a deliberate process of engagement and co-creation. And then finally, a deeper question is consent even the right interpretation of what we owe people in citizen science? So in citizen science, we have people who are sometimes exchanging information who have equal amounts of understanding, and they're not subjects in the kind of way that Christy was talking about. So maybe we can talk instead about informed contribution or informed contributorship, where the goal is to enhance trust among parties in the project and also between the people in the project and those who may use the project results in the future. So here I have in mind something like, if a policymaker wanted to use a citizen science research result, they would probably want to be sure that there was no unethical use of human subjects or contributors or participants in that work in order to use it in policy. So a prompt one might use in the citizen science project in thinking about what they owe in terms of informed consent or informed contribution is, what do people need to know in this project in order to participate knowingly and freely? And the answer will vary by project. So I wanted to close by giving a quick example from an article with research with First Nations. So Juan Towery engaged in an extended debate with his IRB, like in the course of a year, regarding the tension between individual and community consent. And so he felt that he owed to the communities he was working with a community consent model that they appreciated. And so these are the ways in which he described it. He wanted to work to establish relations, ensure participant input into all aspects of the research design, establish community ownership of data analysis and reporting, and identify what the research could give back to the community. And key to this protracted but necessary process was obtaining consent via the establishment of a trust-based negotiated relationship. According to my participants, what was neither necessary nor important was individual paper-based consent. So we might think in citizen science of consent, even though consent in biomedical research is supposed to be a process, it might be a much more robust and richer process in citizen science than in health research. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Leah.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And I would really like to check out that resource you've got there, the citation by Towery Research, Ethics, Informed Consent, and the Disempowerment of First Nations Peoples. If you could maybe type that into the chat box, and if there's a link you could include, I think a lot of people would find that very, very helpful.
Yep, will do.
And I'd like to make sure we touch on that during the group discussion as well. So with that, and so thank you, Lisa. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Camille Nebecker. She's an associate professor of behavioral medicine in the Department of Family Medicine and Public Health, School of Medicine at UC San Diego. Her research and teaching focus on two intersecting areas. First, research capacity building, participant-led, community-engaged research, and two, digital health research ethics. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Camille.
Thank you. Thanks very much. My focus is going to be more on a unique type of citizen science that I've been increasingly involved with over the past couple of years, and how consent is being obtained in participant-led research. And so the definition of participant-led research is when participants are actually both the researcher and the participant. And so this goes back to what Christy was talking about, where they're both designing the research and participating in the research. And it really creates some interesting conversations around how do you obtain informed consent when that's the situation. And so three cases that I'm going to briefly go over are how participant-led research has been conducted in the quantified self community. And I participated in a participant-led research study about 2 years ago at the invitation of Gary Wolf from Quantified Self, because they were doing a participant-led study that involved daily testing of cholesterol and lipid levels. And so this was a group of people who are affiliated with Quantified Self who routinely do self-tracking of different types of health-related influences. And so this group wanted to do a blood testing study where they would collect their blood lipids and answer questions about their unique specific interest. And so they created their own research questions. They designed a study. They determined how often they were going to collect their data, how they were going to store their data. And one of the things that Gary was really interested in when starting this study is how do we do consent? How do we think through the risks and benefits, and how do we mitigate risks when we're doing a study on ourselves? So that's one situation that I'll talk a little bit about. The other one is the Open Humans platform, where people are able to invite other people to help to understand a health concern. And one example would be creating a community that has experienced cluster headaches and trying to look to see what kind of triggers are associated with onset of a cluster headache. And so somebody may start a study and invite other people to join in to contribute data to answer these questions. And another group that I've been involved with here locally at UC San Diego and in the San Diego area is Project Apollo. And these are a group of patients who are really motivated to conduct self-study to help themselves manage their own personal health conditions, but also with a goal of sharing that information with their physician so that there can be much more of a partnership in the health system where their clinician is really interested in patient-generated data. And so one of the things that is common across these three groups is that they are not affiliated with an academic institution. They're not funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, and as such, the common rule does not apply to the work that they're doing. In addition, they don't really satisfy the definition of research with a human subject, because research, as the definition in the federal regulation states, it's a systematic investigation designed to contribute generalizable knowledge. And doing self-study can contribute to generalizable knowledge, but that may not be the intention. And if you're not doing research, then a human subject doesn't really come into the discussion. But a human subject is a living individual about whom a researcher, professional, or student can collect information about that individual through interaction or an intervention. So it's not, these types of studies don't map to our federal definitions. And so it also, creates kind of a mismatch. If the person is doing a study that is associated with an academic who is covered by the federal regulations, oftentimes the IRBs are not really understanding how this research is happening and what the roles are of the different parties. So it can get really quite confusing using our existing system. So the blood tester project grew out of years of discussion. They wanted to know, how would we do these blood lipid tests at home? How do diet and exercise affect our cholesterol? But we were interested in whether or not this process of self-consent could be used by participants to evaluate their own choice to participate in a group participant-led research study, and whether or not we could apply the ethical principles of autonomy, beneficence, and justice when making some decisions about consent when academic governance wasn't a part of the study. So we did a pilot test, and then we started to convene the group once we had the protocol in place to start talking about what did we need to think about in terms of potential risks, potential benefits, and how would any risks that were raised be mitigated. And we continued that dialogue not only at the very beginning of the study, but throughout the study, through weekly webinars, through group meetings. We had a Slack channel. And then at the end of the study process, we conducted semi-structured interviews with all of the participants to better understand whether or not they were surprised by anything that happened, whether they would have liked more information. And that all led to really trying to think through how should these studies be governed. And what we came up with were these 9 guiding principles for participant-led research: that transparency, who was involved, how they were involved, who was in the leadership, where was the money coming from if there was any funding. They wanted access to experts. Many of the people who participated were very well educated, but they were not trained in research. And so they needed to know how to design a study, how to manage data, how to analyze data. And so that was something that was a real critical piece to this. Access to data, making decisions independently about whether they shared their data, having the right to withdraw if they chose to. The study needed to be relevant to them and their interests. Responsibility, again, it was a self-responsibility, but what expectations did they have for the people that had initiated the study? So these are published in this paper that I have at the bottom of the screen, which is open access, so anybody can take a look at that. And then with Project Apollo, this was a group that didn't have experience with self-tracking. And so one of the things that we did was we organized some in-person meetings to help the group think through just some basic foundational components of what research is. So basic research literacy training. And while they're learning about the research process and research design, starting to develop their own self-tracking process about looking to see what they wanted to study, what their hypothesis might be, and how they would go about collecting data. So it was a learning doing approach that we did with the Apollo group. And we modified a curriculum that I had developed years ago called Building Research Integrity and Capacity that we are now modifying for access to citizen scientists so that they can learn more about the scientific method. And then the work that Mad Prime is doing with Open Humans, she has this platform where people can create their own projects and interact with others. And so as part of that process, she has created a community review process. So people from the community can look at the protocol. It's visible to all. And what I found really interesting with this one study that was open for people to comment on, there were 44 interactions and comments about how to create a more ethical, responsible study in this one situation on research with Mobility Data Analyzer. So for resources, we've been working on these for a while. We have launched a new center at UC San Diego called the Research Center for Optimal Digital Ethics in Health. And the acronym is Recode Health. We have our core platform, which is a learning community for people that are using digital tools to help better understand themselves, and all the way from N of 1 self-study to large cohort studies. So it's a community that's sharing protocols, they're sharing consent language, there's a forum for asking questions. We have uploaded our BRIC curriculum to our site so that people can have access to the modules. And then we're creating new tools for helping people to think through the questions that they should be thinking about when they design a study. And this framework was informed by researchers who have been doing research in the digital health space. But the kinds of the framework and the checklist can be really helpful for anybody making a decision about next steps in terms of their involvement in a research study. It can be, an individual, it can be a researcher, it can be an IRB, it can be a startup company. And so these are some of the questions that we think people should be asking themselves when they make a decision about moving forward. And that's that. I'll stop there and turn it on over to John. Or back to whoever's moderating.
Sorry, it took a moment to do the switch here. So yes, I'd like to introduce John Wilbanks. He's the Chief Commons Officer at Sage BioNetworks. Previously, John worked as a legislative aide to Congressman Fortnigh Pete Stark, serving as a first assistant director at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And he founded and led to the acquisition of bioinformatics company Intellico. So with that, I'd hand it over to John.
Hello, I've just tried to share my screen and it's not letting me do it, so give me one more second here. There we go. Okay. Am I sharing effectively here now?
Not yet, but while you're working on that, I again ask that people submit their questions to the Q&A box. So we will discuss those during the discussion session after your talk. And also speakers, if you would put in the chat box links to articles or references that you mentioned in your presentations. Okay, it looks like you're ready to go. John, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you to the CSA for having me be part of this. I work at a nonprofit organization called Sage BioNetworks, where we try to take the concepts around open science and put them in practice and see what we learn when we do that. And I'm going to follow on to what Camille talked about as well as the other presenters, but I'm going to really focus more on pragmatics. There are quite a few sets of principles that we have learned as a community over the last several years about informed consent, particularly in a digital context. And the ways that we can use those as part of toolkits in particular, which make it easy for citizen scientists to implement some of the kinds of informed consent methodologies that used to be pretty expensive and difficult to do, and that required institutional backing. But the nice thing about the move towards mobile health or mobile citizen science research is that we can implement many of these on phones or screens using open source toolkits that make it pretty easy to do the right thing. Given that one of the themes of today is that in the absence of the regulatory requirement to do the right thing, it's still the right thing to do to obtain informed consent whenever possible when you're enrolling people in research studies. So the first principle that we try to maintain at Sage is it's good to have enrollment in your study, but it's also important to avoid dark patterns. And so Dark patterns are what are often known as different ways of getting people to enroll in studies without necessarily reading the terms and conditions, which is something that's quite common in non-research applications. So one of the first things to realize is that you cannot simply put a document up on the screen in 9-point font and have people sign that and call it informed consent. We know that people physically don't read on screens the same way that they read in print. You can see here a pretty clear illustration of the F pattern. So this is simply scanning through web pages, not reading all of the content, but reading more at the top, scanning down, reading a bit more at the middle, and then moving mainly down around the edge. This is a very persistent pattern in reading. The reality is that even in the absence of the F pattern, we simply read faster on screens. When you do basic word count analysis of how long it ought to take someone to read versus how long they say it took them to read, they're clearly only reading 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 words on the screen compared to what they think that they're reading. So this is one set of problems, which is the physical difference in the way that we read things on screens. There's also a cultural conditioning that has to be taken into account, which is we've gotten very used to clicking OK on complicated legal agreements that are between us and our goals on screens. And this is a side effect of software click wrap agreements, privacy policies, and in general, this is a social form of conditioning that cuts against any sort of informed consent if all we do is put the document on the screen and ask people to sign it. So the advice that we give at SAGE is whether you are regulated by the common rule or not, the best policy, if you wish to be ethical, is to design your informed consent process with the intent to slow people down, provoke them to think, and anticipate the kinds of study activities, benefits, and risks that they think might come to that person for being part of a research process. At SAGE, we developed a form of informed consent that we call visual consent. I'm sorry, I'm getting a text that my slides aren't showing. I've got sharing working on my screen. Leah, are they showing to you?
I can see them. If other people are having trouble seeing them, why don't you text or send a chat to Rihanna, because I'm wondering if it's individual.
Well, John, I'm only seeing a screen share of the Sage Bionetworks webpage. We just wanted to confirm if you were wanting to show slides.
No, I'm showing slides. Let me try maximizing.
Maybe try
them.
checking.
Can you
there
see
we
them
go.
now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We do see your like presenter mode, so you might want to switch it to.
Okay, let me swap displays.
If you have multiple screens, sometimes.
How's that?
Perfect. All right,
okay.
Thank you.
So, all right, here we are. Okay, thank you for texting me. So what we did at SAGE was develop a set of UX, user experience methodologies for slowing people down. So this is where we started. So this 5 years ago was developed as part of our partnership with Apple for the Research Kit framework. And the idea was to match this visual information area, the icon, with a main concept and a small text information area. We know from research from the Washington Post and other web journalism that this combination of an on-task picture, headline, and subheadline slows down eye gaze fixation to a speed that is similar to that in print. And the idea is that you can then create more or less a study narrative out of these kinds of screens that walks people through the information in much the way that a person at an institution, a clinical research coordinator, might walk you through information. And you can build this linear narrative around what's happening in the research, what's happening to your data, what's the impact on your life, what's involved, what are your rights, what are the risks and benefits. And then at the very end, you can present the consent form for signing. And you get some sense because of this that you're actually able to teach a certain amount of the study to a person without expecting them to read the legal document, which again can be complicated and on screens might not be read in full by your participants, in a way that is, even in the absence of regulation, does really start to move closer towards informing. We've tried to expand this, so we've got different versions. This is a second version or a 2.0 of the same study, where we simply say on the right we have the user interface, the very high level, very easy to read version of the content. On the left, we have the literal text from the consent document. Based on feedback from participants in an advisory board, this is another kind of interface that can be used. Everything I'm showing here is open source and available in our toolkit. This is the Elements of Informed Consent Toolkit. You can see the link at the bottom here. Once I finish my presentation, I'll post the link for this in the chat. The idea being that, we have an entire pedagogical toolkit that will walk you through the entire process of creating informed consent for electronic consent, ranging from how to draft the underlying document, how to build these kinds of interfaces, real examples, links to open source implementations that you can use to build on, and a variety of other tools that you can use to do informed consent, again, whether or not you're at an institution. We try to leverage developer culture. So we have worked with Apple and the Research Kit framework to develop, this is the actual programming guide to programming visual consent on iPhones. There's a similar implementation in Research Stack, which is the open source equivalent for Android. We've worked on privacy toolkits. So if you have a mobile device, it's not simply the informed consent that regulates, it's also the privacy policy. So we've tried to implement for designers. And so this is the same sort of thing that I just showed for Research Kit, but it's actually written explicitly for designers. So it's available in Figma as well as in GitHub, where you can have design patterns that help you walk through how to build a privacy policy, much the same way that you would build for a toolkit. This also is a good forcing function to think about, where's the data going to be hosted? Will the data be transferred to third parties beyond the study? And if so, for what purpose? Because if you're going to upload a research app to either the Google App Store or the Apple App Store, they will request that you give them a privacy policy. And this is a way to walk your participants and users through what they should expect as part of being in a study. You might also contemplate videos. At SAGE, we've been part of the All of Us research program, which is a large 1 million person 10-year study of American residents that will include more risky and complex data. So we know that in many cases there are desires to use direct-to-consumer genomics or other kinds of DNA analysis. You can go and grab the information from the All of Us research program. All of it as a government work is in the public domain. So you have here the text of the video that explains DNA analysis as part of that program, as well as the video animations that help explain in the same way that the icon does. We can tell you that these kinds of interfaces work. So this is across 200,000 people who've gone through the All of Us research program consent. We do, as part of a teach back in that program, ask people to answer some questions to see if they understood questions like, what's the purpose of the study? And so in this case, the purpose of the study is not to give medical advice, but to help make discoveries about health. And you can see even across a wide range of educational attainment that we're in 90% or above accuracy of answering this question correctly. This gives us a hint that these kind of processes actually really do, in a virtual context, help people make informed choices about whether or not they'd like to enroll in the research. And so, as I said, you can go and you can grab the consent forms, HIPAA authorizations, which are necessary for studies that are thinking about using EHR data as it comes out of health systems, electronic health records data. And again, you can access using the link below. The point of all of this is the barrier to doing informed consent in a meaningful way is not whether or not you're part of an institution or whether or not you're part of a regulated entity. There's enough open source tools available and enough open source code bases available that the primary thing that is between you and doing informed consent is your desire to do informed consent. And the hope is that these kinds of open source tools help people who are doing science in a new way or a new place, but still believe that this idea that giving people enough information to make an informed choice ought to be part of the foundation of the science, whether it's happening in a regulated institution or not. With that, I'll stop. You should feel free to contact me either on Twitter or by email. And as I said, I'll put all these links into the chat, and I will make these slides available on SlideShare after the presentation is over. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, John, and all the panelists. If you could put your contact information in the chat box so that people can reach out to you directly, particularly if they might have an interest in collaborating or have additional questions. We've had several questions come through the Q&A. I encourage you to add your questions to the Q&A box and we will begin. Unfortunately, it doesn't give a name for the who submitted the first question, but says, could you touch on some EU law issues if possible, and where we might find out more. We do have a member from the European Citizen Science Association as part of our CSA Law and Policy Working Group, Anna Berti-Suman. I think we're going to invite her to give a presentation, as well as there's a researcher I just connected with, Loretta Tongeny in Czechoslovakia, who is also doing research and coming out with a legal issues of citizen science, particularly around consent and ethics, for the Handbook on Citizen Science. Christy, do you want to jump in there? You had mentioned another resource.
Sure. Hold on, let me pull it up. So that another resource that I recommended, that's a nice snapshot of human subjects protections in 131 countries, was compiled by the Office for Human Research Protections within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So this compilation is called the International Compilation of Human Research Standards, and I provided a link to it.
Wonderful, thank you. And for those from Europe who are participating, if you have some topic areas you'd like us to cover in our Law and Policy and Ethics webinar series, please reach out. I will include my email address, because we would definitely like to highlight some of the legal issues that are in Europe, and particularly GDPR around privacy is something we've been thinking about. Adam asks, if we are analyzing the quality of the data taken by citizen scientists, quantitatively comparing their data to a laboratory assistance data for similar samples, does them make them a subject of the study? The data in this case is water quality, pH, nitrates, phosphates, etc., not related to the scientist as a person, or the data collector as a person. And Christy, we'll start with you, but if the other panelists want to jump in, I'd also invite them to answer.
Sure. So my brief answer is that this is tricky. And this is exactly where, this is an example of exactly where the common rule is not very accommodating and hasn't really thought through, how individuals might participate in research in ways other than sitting in a chair and having biospecimens extracted from them. So it might fall under the definition of human subjects research. It might also qualify for one of the exceptions. I just mentioned that there are exceptions in my presentation, but I think they're important. And in particular, I would point out 3 exceptions that might be especially relevant to citizen science settings. And the first one concerns research that's conducted in educational settings that specifically involves educational practices. The second exception refers to research that includes interactions involving survey procedures and interview procedures, observation of public behavior, and then there are some more conditions around that. And then the third exception refers to research involving benign behavioral interventions. So my suggestion is that, I'm assuming, of course, that this study is federally funded, and so even satisfies that first hurdle, is that if you have access to an IRB, that you consult the IRB. They will have an opinion on this. And I have found that IRBs tend to want to be asked these questions. And if the study does not, in their opinion, fall under the common rule, they might want to provide a statement of non-research. I have received those for my own research, or at least confirm that the research would fall under one of those exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Christy, for those who may not be familiar, you laid out 3 different exceptions. What do you mean by survey observations and public behavior? What do you mean by benign behavioral studies?
Yeah, so benign behavioral interventions are actually defined in the common rule. I'm hesitant to get too far into the weeds because some language also is new. I mentioned briefly the fact that the common rule was recently revised, and those revisions went into effect in January 2019. So some of this we're going to have to work out, but just the question about benign behavioral interventions, those are defined in the rule as interventions that are brief in duration, harmless, painless, not physically invasive, not likely to have a significant adverse lasting impact on the subjects, and the investigator has no reason to think that the subjects will find the interventions offensive or embarrassing. So a number of conditions have to be met. And that's just an example of how these exceptions are treated in the common rule.
Mm-hmm. Lorette, thank you, Christy. Does anybody else on the panel want to jump in? Any comments on that question? Okay. Loretta asks, community consent, and I think this was submitted after Lisa's talk. Should it be legally authorized? Should there be a legally authorized representative to give a community-informed consent? How do you ensure that this representative who provides the informed consent is actually representing the community? And you know, you might say, okay, if you're working with a tribe, for example, who within the tribe would be able to give consent on the behalf of the whole community? I worked with tribes, for example, for 10 years doing participatory mapping projects. And they had a council that consisted of the directors of each of their tribal government entities, as well as the university, that would review proposals, research proposals to work on the reservation and provide approval or not. But then they also had a traditional government or drum circle of elders, and should we have run it by them as well? That created some questions. Lisa, you had an answer or a response to Loretta's question.
I did. I think about this question a lot, and so I agree it's really important, Loretta. I think what I said in my response was that some of it might have to do with how the community organizes itself. So some will understand themselves or have taken steps in the past to make a legal recognition of some formal structure. But many in citizen science, I don't think will have done that, especially when it's geographically organized, neighborhood organized, organized around a common cause, for example, water or air quality in an area. And so I think in those cases, it's particularly tricky. And maybe the answer is something like, don't try and find a single representative, but instead think about the community as a whole and engaging with the community on a frequent or at least regular, more than occasional, more than once kind of basis. So in the article I linked in the chat box by Juan Tauri, I think he describes a series of meetings and discussions with the community so as to establish trust and relationship, ask community how they felt about things. He did not mention a particular dispute that arose or a disagreement within the community about how to proceed, and I think that would be an additional wrinkle.
Does anybody else on the panel like to respond to that question? So again, I encourage folks on the line to add their questions either to the Q&A question icon there at the bottom. You can click on that and submit your question, or in the chat box. While we're waiting for others to submit questions, is there anyone in the audience that has a good informed consent process that they'd like to share? Please, raise your hand in the chat box, and we will turn on your mic so you can share that process. While we're waiting for folks to jump in on that, I think this was Camille. You asked, should we require certification or licensing in order for a person to be able to conduct self-experiments? And that gets more into the DIY bio, I think, realm. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the citizen science is incredibly broad, as we've been talking about today. In some cases, it's led by an academic that has training and research and study design. and is partnering with community members as data collection partners, where they're given a protocol, they're told how to go about collecting data, how to record data, and so there's some training going on. In some cases, the community is driving the question that they want to have studied, and they partner with a trained scientist to design the study that can help answer the questions that they would like to have addressed in their community. So that's still a partnership with community citizen science trained researchers. But as I'm seeing more do-it-yourself, biohacking, quantified self, there's so many different names for people that they have the tools now, more access than ever before. If any of you have watched Unnatural Selection on Netflix, you can see the range of activity that are going on where people can buy CRISPR kits on the internet and do self-experiments in their garage. So, my question is, should there be some minimal standard, like for me to drive a car, I have to have a license showing that I have some competencies? So I'm putting the question out to others. If people are going to do self-experiments and have access to products that they can purchase online, is there anything that should be happening in this space to help govern and increase safety for people?
Oh. So I know one example, a medical doctor who was researching H. pylori, right? And he wasn't getting traction with his ideas with the research community, so he ingested H. pylori himself to discover that is the source of ulcers, but he was a certified medical professional. What are some of the examples maybe you could provide of where, I know with like Ubiome and such, where you're experimenting on yourself?
Oh, well, I'm not going to cite the Netflix story, but I just more common people that are curious about their own health and they want to start collecting data. They may not know that collecting data at a certain time of day might influence. Maybe they're looking at heart rate and influences of caffeine. It could be relatively simple. But if you don't know that when you collect your data and how you record it, and just the process of doing research, you may not be able to make any sense of your results. And so maybe, is it okay that we're doing trial and error, which we've all done throughout humanity? But when it gets to a stage where it could actually be life or death, I think about Dana Lewis and the amazing work she's done with OpenAPS, and she's been incredibly thoughtful about how she shares information about how you can, close the loop on your insulin pump. And so she's been thoughtful about how to make that safe, but she's not a trained scientist. I'm sure she could have a PhD easily now with all the work that she's done. But again, it's solving your own health problems, whatever that may be, and then sharing information with others who can then learn from your experience and try something for themselves.
So getting certified or licensed for that seems like a bit of a heavy lift for the average person. There has been some discussion about kind of non-institutional IRBs. It may even be a community group that wants to do research, right? But they're not part of a university setting where they don't have access to the institutional review board process. And this may be a place where those kind of risks could come to light for an individual.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And I think the work that Mad Ball is doing with Open Humans is along that line. Like, can we bring the community together to do peer review and to help somebody who's designing a study identify where the gaps are? So I see it like a version of Stack Overflow where you have community support. And you hope that somebody in that community will have the expertise to chime in and help you make sure you're not heading down a dangerous path.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment? I see John nodding, for example, but there's also probably ethical issues. So others like to jump in?
If I could just jump in very quickly and say that we do, again, we have our background legal rules operating. So first, there are First Amendment implications, right? That individuals are allowed to generally share this information on the internet. And there are concerns about the extent to which that might encourage others to engage in risky behavior that they might not otherwise before even appreciating the risk, right? So the conversation comes back to consent and appreciation and voluntariness. But there are also tort laws. And so that might be sort of the last legal solution, but we have them. So, to the extent that, individuals are injured in the course of self-experimentation, following the instructions of someone else who provided those instructions, recklessly or negligently or knowing that they would injure another, they may have a lawsuit against that person.
Mm. John, would you like to jump in?
No, I was just agreeing with Camille, which I have a habit of doing.
Lisa, I thought you unmuted, so go ahead.
Yeah, just briefly, I think I agree with everything that's been said. And in terms of thinking about asymmetries of power and knowledge, one of the wrinkles that I worry about in the DIY community is peer pressure, particularly with rare orphan diseases and conditions like that, where each individual participant added to the group matters a lot. And I can imagine a lot of peer pressure being brought to bear, which is a very different dynamic than the typical researcher subject power dynamic that we typically worry about in informed consent.
So any other questions from the online audience? I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A box or in the chat. So just want to make sure we give people a last opportunity. Any other additional thoughts from the panelists as we begin to wrap up the discussion?
I see a raised hand.
Oh, there's a raised hand. Where do you see that?
Well, it just went up and now it went back down.
Okay, whoever raised their hand. Rihanna, are you able to unmute that person?
Have I been unmuted?
Yes.
Yep.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm just writing a question for the question and answer box. I have not quite finished, but I'll have it ready in a second. Should I just
go ahead
ask
verbally?
it here?
Yeah, go ahead verbally.
All right, sorry. Our question here is not really related to the topics discussed, but it still has to do with consent. We're working on a government project that has to do with collecting weather-related impacts on agriculture. And one of the problems we're facing is we're not really allowed to collect any information on our volunteers who are submitting information to us on weather reports in their area. We can't collect any personally identifying information. And as a result of not really knowing who they are, we're having trouble building a community of engaged and motivated participants. And I know that many other federal programs around the world or government-funded programs must be facing similar constraints. And I'm just wondering how other groups are dealing with this. How do you build, when you face these restrictions on collecting information, contact information, how do you build effective engagement with participants and build motivation and express our appreciation to keep them active?
So where are you located?
In Canada.
Oh, in Canada. Okay. All right, panelists, anyone want to jump in?
I have nothing concrete to offer, I'm sorry, but the one thing that does occur to me is when I've seen people in biohacking forums, they often have anonymous or made up names. And so if you could provide a platform that helps people anonymize and yet still communicate, that might be one start.
Okay, good.
Anyone else on the panel? No, so I want to unpack this a little bit more. So you say you're not allowed to collect information on the people's names. Why is that? What privacy law or other paperwork reduction acts like law that's preventing you from doing that?
Well, we have an online survey system where the public can can fill out the survey and report on weather impacts in their area. But we're not allowed to collect their name or information because then it could provide, they would personally identifying information on their location, it's just the government regulations on privacy. So we're receiving a lot of reports from the public, but we want to be able to encourage them and build dialogue with them so we can encourage their ongoing participation. But because we don't know who they are, we're really having trouble finding out, developing methods to engage with them. I don't know if I've explained.
Yeah, so I think without understanding the legal context in which you're having to operate, it makes it a bit difficult. But I might suggest Teresa Scassa. She is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, who's done a lot of work on the legal and ethical issues of volunteer geographic information and participatory mapping, which has some overlap with the kind of citizen science data you're describing. And she's part of a larger research initiative that Renee Sieber is running. And I think they might be very good resources for you. So I'll type that contact information into the chat box. I see we have, is that the question that you had submitted? Or Ann Fritz asked, is there a way that we can digitally join a community, an opt-in sort of thing, that we see with feedback? I'm not sure if I follow that. Rihanna, could you unmute Anna Fritz, Ann Fritz, so that we can, maybe she can ask her question verbally. And maybe mute the gentleman that just was speaking. Ann, can you hear us?
It looks like she was actually making a suggestion to the previous speaker.
The previous question.
Might be a solution.
In response to that previous question, it's just curious that governments try to protect people, but it prevents them from being part of a community that they may very much want to volunteer to participate. I'm wondering if there could be a disclaimer when people share information through the form, that there is a community of people that are interested in having a dialogue about sharing information about weather, and would the government prevent that from happening? Because then the people that are contributing could become a community, and then you could learn more about them. It just seems like sometimes the rules and create barriers that just don't make sense. So anyway, yeah, I was just thinking there should be a way for people to be able to be involved voluntarily.
Yes, that's exactly what we're looking into. And that's a very good point. We're trying to build interest in this program, but the legal restrictions in place are preventing that from taking place. So we're caught in a difficult situation where we're trying to protect privacy, but at the same time provide programming and develop this program that really benefits the agricultural industry in the country.
If I can make another suggestion, so I've been doing work around genetic genealogy, and genetic genealogists have formed their own community. They are very, very active on Facebook, and there are a handful of Facebook groups that are well moderated, and that might be a model to look into as well.
Excellent. Well, I see we're beginning to wind down in terms of participation. So I will ask each of the panelists to provide a final comment, and then we'll close. Well, maybe starting with the order in which we spoke, then Christy, Lisa, John, and Camille.
Oh, I'm sorry, Leah, are we signing off and saying goodbye?
Yeah, it looks like people are beginning to drop away since we're past the hour, and we don't have any new questions. So I'd like to close the webinar and ask that each of you make a final comment, starting with Christy.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to engage in this with this panel. I think that these consent questions are very tricky, but so important. And so I was glad to see the CSA sponsor this webinar.
Yeah, I'll echo what Christy said. I'm happy to be on the panel and discuss all of this with you. The one other prevailing idea that keeps hitting me is how much control over our concepts the regulatory frameworks have. When we think about informed consent, we are continually driven back to thinking about, in the United States, the way the common rule articulates it. We have to be intentional about going outside of that framework and thinking about what do we owe to whom and why in citizen science, I think.
Camille?
I just really do appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I think consent is incredibly important, and it's getting hijacked not only by our federal regulations, but by terms of service and how we're interacting with people generally. I love the work that SAGE has done to make consent more accessible and visual, and I think we just really need to have many, many more community conversations and increase research literacy and tech literacy and data literacy so people really truly can be informed when they are consenting. And so I think more work on this is needed, and it needs to go above and beyond the letter of the law and really look at the spirit of the law.
Thank you. John, last word.
Hard to go last because everyone else said all the good stuff. But I mean, I think I'll echo what Camille said, which is that the most important thing here is that, you know, beyond what the law and the regs say informed consent is simply being ethical with the people that are helping you do science. Whether you're a citizen or a professional scientist is really not the question. It's, you know, are you going to live up to the idea that you should offer people enough information that they can make an informed choice, including to say no? Because as citizen scientists start doing more and more science that involves human participation, they'll run into the same problems that professional scientists do, which is it's hard to convince people to do the tasks you want to do to gather your data. And you will face the same temptations to hide the realities, to sort of soft pedal the risks and overstate the benefits that professional scientists have got. And so one of the criticisms of institutional science is the way that it doesn't listen to people like citizens. And the worst thing would be to recapitulate their failures in a race for engagement and enrollment. And there's enough stuff out there. We've seen a lot of it on this call. There's plenty of stuff out there. If you take the time to be intentional and say, what do I need to reveal? What's the truth, and how do I communicate the truth honestly to my participants? You'll get more participation over time. Because, you know, unlike a professional scientist, all a citizen scientist has is his or her credibility in the community. And if you engage in meaningful, intentional, informed consent, your credibility is going to be higher over time than people who don't. And all I can say is reach out. We're here to help, and we're here to help you learn how to use these toolkits, and you know, go forth and do science.
That's wonderful. I noticed that Holly Rybeck, while we were talking, has added a quick comment at the end. Holly works with the NASA Citizen Science team, so in the US federal government, and operating under the same kind of restrictions around PII, or privacy information, or information that's private. She writes that the Facebook social media suggestion for the last questioner is exactly how their team tried to build, or is working to build, community with the same kind of legal restrictions that they're under. So that is definitely something that looks like a proven method. I'd like to thank all our panelists here. They've done a fantastic job. I'd especially like to thank Lisa, my partner in crime, who's done a tremendous job in helping us to put this together, as well as Jennifer Shirk and Rihanna Putman, who every week or every webinar is there at the call, doing a great job helping us to make this happen. Our next webinar for the Citizen Science Association Law and Policy Working Group is January 24th. We will be doing them every month throughout the spring. If you have ideas, I put in my email address a little bit earlier on the chat box. We'd love to hear your ideas. One of the upcoming webinars will focus on the release of the new special issue of the Citizen Science Association Journal that's focused on policy perspectives, so look towards that. And with that, Rihanna, Jennifer, any last comments as we close?
Nope, just thanks everyone. And we did record